Floods are a frequently occurring natural hazard within our state. To gain a better understanding of floods, we sought the expertise of the Department of Fire and Emergency Services and the Bureau of Meteorology.
In WA, we have quite a number of weather systems that can produce flooding, but I suppose many people would probably recognise that the most common ones are the ones that we get up in our north. During our wet season there, we have tropical cyclones. We also have the tropical lows as well that can come inland, and they can cause a great deal of flooding. As you move further south though, we do have cold fronts that bring flooding during the winter months. We can have some heavy falls of rain with those. We also have things called northwest cloud bands. They can bring in quite a lot of rain as well. And even our thunderstorms as well during the summer months and also during the winter months can bring some heavy falls. So there are many types of weather systems that can create floods, and all of those are monitored very, very closely by the Bureau. When we're looking at systems that are likely to bring a lot of heavy rainfall, that's not the only factor that we need to look at. We're also looking at the actual soil moisture and how moist the soil is. If you have a saturated soil, if you have the river basins being very, very wet, then you don't need as much rainfall to go in there to flood them as you do as if they're dry. So the catchment, the moisture in the catchment, the soil moisture are very, very important factors in looking into the likelihood of a flood, how quickly that flood may occur. But probably the key is obviously the rainfall, the amount of rain that's going to fall, and the period of time that that rain is going to fall in as well. Well, basically the Bureau has three classifications of flood. We have what we call the riverine flood, which is where the river bursts its banks. We have a tidal surge, so coastal inundation, and we have the flash flooding as well, and the flash flooding can really occur anyway. In terms of what is a flood, it's essentially where the water shouldn't be. So if you've got a river, you'd like to see the water staying within the banks of the river. When it overflows that river, you then have a flood. You'd like to see the tidal issues where the sea is actually staying where the sea should be. And then with the flash flooding, as I said, that can occur anywhere, and really even in an urban area you can get those quite quickly. So the three types of flood that we've got.
The different areas of the state experience different kinds of floods, and so the risk tends to shift during the winter months in the south and generally during the summer months in the north of the state. And that's because of the tropical lows, the cyclones that we get that bring a lot of rain during the summer, and then because of the big cold fronts that cross the southern and the western coastline during the winter months. Now the areas that are going to be a greater risk, of course, is where the people are, and they tend to be the lower lying areas like Bunbury, in areas like Mandurah around the Undarup canals, even in areas near rivers and in floodplains like Northam and York and Beverley. We know that there's quite a high risk there if we get the rainfall that's going to cause the flooding. Now, if we talk up into the north, it's one thing to be living near a river and on a floodplain, such as the Fitzroy River, but then we get those extreme downpours where we had a lot of rain come through in a very short space of time. We even get inland risks where a basin will fill up with water too quite quickly. In the early 2000s, we had a remote Aboriginal community at Kirakara, just on the West Australian side of the West Australian Northern Territory border. Actually had to be evacuated because of flooding. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It was in a basin, and the water had been filling up in other areas, and then it got to the stage where they'd had so much rain out there that the rain just couldn't get away. It couldn't get past sand ridges, and it actually flooded their sewage systems. It started to encroach on all their houses, and it couldn't be fixed in a remote community like that. There's just not enough resources to be able to fix it. How do you get rid of that much water? So a whole community had to be relocated.
Looking back through the history books to see, how many floods we've had, we can see that they've occurred for a long period of time, certainly since the 19th century when records started being kept. We've seen some major floods through the Swan Valley, but probably the most sort of significant ones that we've seen recently in 2010, for example, the Carnarvon floods, where the Gascoyne River broke its banks and caused some significant problems for the Gascoyne region and Carnarvon in particular. And then again in 2011 there was a significant flood through the Kimberley, where we saw a lot of rain up through the Kununurra area and some significant flooding through there. And just recently in 2014 there was wide-ranging floods from a tropical low for a broad area of the Kimberley through Kununurra, and we also saw some floods from the same event getting down into the goldfields in towards the Kalgoorlie region as well. So floods occur quite frequently, probably not so much in Perth, but certainly through many parts of our north and into our Gascoyne, Midwest regions as well, and even into the goldfields, we can see these floods.
Whilst in the process of issuing a flood watch and warning, the Bureau of Meteorology engages with a range of organisations, including agencies and media. Neil Bennett explains.
When it comes to the actual issuing of watches and warnings, the first thing is obviously, are we looking at any heavy rainfall events? So that's done through the Bureau of Meteorology and its forecasters, the meteorologists using numerical weather prediction models, computer models that will tell us if there's likely to be heavy rainfall. Over a period going out 4 to 7 days, we'll be monitoring that situation very, very closely. Hydrologists are then informed of the likelihood of heavy rain by the meteorologists. They then look at the soil catchment moisture and use soil moisture models as well, and then combine that with statistical models to see just how quickly the catchment is going to soak, how far the river is going to rise. So it's a combination of things, but by far the most important thing is the rainfall, but then you add in on top of that the moisture systems, the moisture in the soil, the moisture in the catchment, how quickly that's going to flood, and then the hydrologists are monitoring that really closely over a period of time and then issuing the warnings as needs be. During the time when we think there is likely to be flood activity, we're in close contact with the major hazard warning agency, which is Department of Fire and Emergency Services. So we're talking to them on a daily basis, we're giving them briefings, alerting them to the possibility of heavy rainfall, potentials of floods. So they're the key partner, I suppose, in this way of warning the community. But we're also in touch with the water authorities as well, and if the situation becomes really bad, then there are also mechanisms by which we can contact local authorities through our warning systems. We have a fairly extensive method of getting warnings out through email. We use our website as well, and we also now are in social media, so we can use that channel to get warnings out to the general community. But when it comes to the actual agency, Department of Fire and Emergency Services, but then to get the warning message out, we're in contact with the local ABC as well as other community radios and the local media as well.
So what about some of the key impacts of floods, as well as recovery costs and trends? Alan and Neil explain.
So the impacts that we generally expect throughout WA from floods, we generally classify as either structural or non-structural. When we start talking in the, say, the physical environment, where we're looking at the impact on land, we're looking at the impact on farming, the impact on our buildings, the impact on our infrastructure, it can be quite significant. The other top non-structural effects that are a big concern to us are those that are more on the social side of it, where we're talking about people suffering through loss, through the need to evacuate. When we look at some of our communities, particularly isolated communities, where they've had to leave their homes and not come back for more than 12 months, very difficult for a community to actually survive during that time and then still come back together as one. It has big cultural impact, big social impact, and it has a huge impost, of course, on community from a dollars and cents perspective. The obvious impacts from flooding are usually those associated with fast-moving water. Certainly, we're talking about rising water, but people always relate to it moving fast and washing away things like cars and washing away parts of your home. We're talking about erosion of the river banks. But I think some of the more hidden ones, when you're starting to talk agriculture, I know of examples in Carnarvon where 6 months after a flood has abated, where we've got plants actually falling over because the root system has rotted. And the reason why they're falling over is because the fruit is just starting to ripen, it gets heavy, and it's just time for it to go to market. And so what will happen there, we get all these growers who all of a sudden got a loss of income. Costs associated with flooding are on the increase, albeit you would probably say it's proportional with the population growth. What we do see is that as we improve our infrastructure in floodplains and near flood areas, as the population grows in those areas, then the costs in the recovery process starts to increase. That starts to overlap into the fact that we're doing recovery far, far better nowadays as a community than what we did in the past too. What do we see in the immediate future with respect to costs, particularly in the recovery aspect of it? One would hope that proportionally the costs start to drop off, certainly per head, but it's pretty hard to base it on per head. What we're going to see is a more prepared community. I think we're going to see far improved infrastructure to be able to cope with it, because as infrastructure does get washed away, destroyed or damaged, it is replaced, and it's generally replaced to a higher standard.
It's really difficult when we're looking into the future, even short term, but if we're looking at trends over a 30, 40-year period or even a 10-year period, it's hard to pinpoint if we're going to see increased flood activity. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that we've experienced a decrease in rainfall in our southwest over the last 30 years. That would lead you to suspect that we could potentially see a decrease in floods, but floods themselves are driven by weather events. The background climate is there, but if you have an extreme weather event such as a vigorous cold front or even a tropical cyclone moving down towards the southwest, you are going to increase the rainfall. So it's hard for us to predict if there's going to be an increase or a decrease in the actual occurrence of floods. But what we can say is that that southwest region of WA is experiencing a drying trend, so that may mean that soil moisture profiles are becoming harder to saturate. Whereas in our north, during our tropical wet season, we're starting to see an occurrence of more frequent rainfall up there. So very hard for us to say, but certainly a drying trend in the southwest, and those rainfall events that are going to be bringing the floods are individual events, and that's something that we'll be monitoring on a case-by-case scenario.
We're going to see shifts, and we've been seeing it for the last 50 or 60 years, shifts of population out of floodplains and being far, far better prepared to deal with a potential of a flood. I think the most important thing is that we're probably going to see some cycles come back on us again too, which is going to wake up a community probably through the broader part of Western Australia that hasn't been affected by floods. So it's a big part of the education process there. Needs to keep reminding people that Western Australia does suffer from floods right throughout the entire state, and that there's not too many parts of the state that won't be affected in some way by some sort of flood. So people need to be ready, because you never know where it's going to happen. And if anything that I've learnt over the years is that involved communities make all the difference. Now, I've had the experience of living on the Gascoyne River for half a dozen years in Carnarvon, and seeing the way the communities interact, the way the people who live up the river interact with the people who live down the river, as far as knowing how that river behaves, understanding the nature of the threat, made the world of difference to how a community would respond. It was a key part of the planning process.